Hello everybody, I hope you have enjoyed the course so far, despite it being digital, of course. Today is going to be a bit of a shorter lecture, and we're going to address training and human capital investments. This, of course, employees, they are not static beings inside organizations. Over their career, they further develop their skills and abilities, or these change, or they quickly need to adjust their skills and abilities to new demands, for example, digital transformation. So, of course, for organizations, investing in employee skills and abilities, in other words, in their human capital, can be a way to make them more productive, or even redeploy them to other positions in the organization to maintain productivity. So this is what's coming for us today. So we're going to talk about what human capital entails, as well as why and when organizations should invest in such capital. We'll also discuss the issue of multi-skilling, that is, how broad should we develop human capital. As you will see, this also corresponds largely to today's learning goals. So first, to understand when investment in human capital is efficient and effective, that is, economically. Also to grasp who needs to pay, who gets the bill of different kinds of human capital investment. Fact is that training encourages, it doesn't mean organizations have to pay the full training bill each time. See indeed that the decision of who pays, that it will depend on the type of skill that training addresses. Finally, I also hope that after today you will understand the economic issues that organizations face concerning multi-skilling. So to what extent do organizations have to invest in human capital? Which skills matter, which don't? Since I already said this is a short lecture, so today we'll only be covering chapter 19 of Kuhn. But I have enriched, of course, the course material with some more details and examples, especially from the Netherlands. Okay, but first, human capital investments. Why and when? As HR students, everybody has probably heard the saying that employees are an organization's greatest asset. And of course, this is true, but underlying that idea is not the employees themselves are the greatest asset, but rather their knowledge, their skills, their attitude. In other words, their human capital is what constitutes an asset of economic importance to the organization. And there are a couple of factors that underscore that human capital is not only important to organizations, but also that it's continuously challenged. So it remains important that firms keep investing in human capital development. First, of course, is that the current economy is a knowledge-based economy. So knowledge and innovation, they are key sources of competitive advantage for an organization. Production and services in our current economy, they are not based on farming, like is the case in the agricultural economy. They're not based on heavy machinery, as based in an industrial economy, but they are based on knowledge-intensive activities. So where the intellectual capabilities of employees constitute the key inputs, the key resources in the production process. And this, of course, creates a war of talent. So organizations, they are really willing to go the extra mile and offer unique compensation to those employees that possess the right skill set or the right credentials. And often this creates tensions between employers, as they do not only compete for candidates, but they also try to lure or poach candidates away from each other. The third point is that the power shift to the customer. So the internet has made customers very powerful and also very demanding. So one misstep, bam, and we get a bad Google review. So this implies that in addition to their existing skill repertoires, we need to develop employees also to be very customer-orientated, and they need to develop skills in that regard. Fourth, of course, is globalization. Okay, speaks for itself. This is an international class, so some borders, they become more blurred. And is also demonstrated in rises as professional-oriented courses on diversity management, intercultural competencies. They become more important as part of employees' human capital base. And five, the aging workforce. So, as you might know, our department head, Doreen Kuhn, she does research on successful aging at work. So our global economy is currently challenged by demographic aging and rising pension levels. So people have to Yeah, they become older, they stay until an older age in the organizations. This also challenges how we need to rethink the human capital base of organizations. For example, a 70-year-old man, we can't let a 70-year-old man do the heavy work, let him keep doing the heavy work in a factory. Maybe it means we have to move him to an office and look for an alternative job. But this also entails retraining that employee and redeploying that employee, developing his or her human capital in another way. And six, so technological changes. This is more closely to my research line. I research the effects and management of the digital transformation of the workplace. Now, the introduction of technology in the workplace is ever intensifying. This often implies, of course, that firms need to strengthen employees' technological literacy to hit challenges such as techno-stress. I also think the introduction now of wearables, artificial intelligence, algorithms, and so forth, robotics, they will change how we think about the human capital within organizations. Training might be a way of addressing that. Finally, more and more organizations, they adopt team-based working. And this also implies a shift in the type of human capital that we need. So we not only need smart employees, we not only need productive employees, but we also need employees that can cooperate a bit with each other. Now, previous reasons are among the reasons that employers invest in training for their employees. So training in this sense, they are not more than planned programs by the organization. So they're intentional ways to improve employees' human capital base. So, of course, referring to their knowledge, their skills, their attitudes, their behavior, with, of course, ultimate aim of enhancing organizations' performance and competitive positions. Organizations can, of course, organize trainings in different ways. They can do so by formal training, basically what we are doing now, the traditional middle school classroom experience, or e-learning, and so on. Alternatively, they can let their employees, of course, learn in a more natural environment, for example, through traineeships, through internships, or just letting them learn new skills on the job. This is what I'm basically doing now with online teaching. And of course, employees' learning experience can also benefit from a coach or a mentor, somebody that watches their back and shares some tips and tricks that can be useful. Training is all the more important because if organizations fail to develop their employees, they not only risk losing their competitive position, but those employees might also turn over. They may leave the organization. Maybe they will join another firm in the war for talent, where they will get the opportunity to develop themselves. And of course, turnover is a costly endeavor, as we also saw in last class, because then you have to hire new people and you have forego income. So turnover of employees is to be avoided because it's more costly in some cases than training. Unfortunately, as you would have guessed, training is not free either. But let us first look at a bit of numbers from the Central Bureau for Statistics in the Netherlands. For example, we see that less than half of the professional population in the Netherlands is currently enrolled in some kind of professional training. And the large majority of that training, so about 70%, is paid for by the organization, which costs them on average between 1,000 and 1,100 euros per employee. However, we note there are also large differences in training between sectors, employee groups, and organizations. For example, we see in healthcare and financial services, employees typically enjoy more professional training. And not surprisingly, these are also the sectors where there are often legal requirements or frequent changes in law and procedures that urge organizations to send their employees for professional training. Not surprisingly, we see also that employees in larger companies that they also receive more training. And there's more resources, more training resources also there. This, of course, makes working for these organizations very attractive, especially when you are new on the labor market. But also interesting, men are disproportionately more enrolled in professional training. So there's also an inequality dimension involved to professional training. Now, given the popularity of professional training and its price tag, so it's clear that organizations make quite some investment in training so that they are aware of the challenges of human capital investment and the importance of doing so. But then we forget a bit about the employees. So employees, they also make investments in training. Think, for example, about the time and money that you will have invested in your education, your degree, by the end of your university career. In the end, of course, you fully hope that those investments, that they will pay off and that they will give you a better wage or a better job position. But calculating those returns on investments are a bit more complex, a bit more trickier than they initially appear. This is also illustrated in the following example, which is fully worked out in the book, namely Sam's decision to attend a welders program. Okay, between brackets, for people who don't know what welders are, so they are the people who join pieces of metal together. And for the sake of equality and the European spirit, let's assume that Sam is a girl and that she calculates in euros instead of dollars. So this is Sam, meet Sam. Sam is an 18-year-old girl from Tilburg and she wants to attend a welders program. There is a small issue, however, and it is this program costs 20,000 euros and it requires her to invest 1 year full-time. So meaning she can't combine it with her student job at Albert Heijn or another student job. However, she was lucky, she was able to secure a student loan at an interest rate of 8%. Now, she does not do this for nothing. By attending this training, she hopes to make 5,000 extra a year. So without training, she would only make 30,000 euros a year. With the welders training, this would turn into 35,000 euros a year. However, Sam, she's a nice girl, she's also realistic. In the year 2037, when she's 35, she expects robots will totally take over the place, so her welding skills will become obsolete, and then she go back to earning 30,000 a year. So basically, she expects that she will only enjoy the benefits for a little less than 20 years. Now, the question is, should Sam invest in this training or not? Now, this is an example of an optimal training decision. Now, the quick and dirty answer to Sam's question might be yes. Because she will earn 5,000 euros a year more, the program costs 20,000. So if we do not account for taxes, she will earn it back in exactly 4 years. However, of course, this is not the complete picture. Why not? Because Sam also has to look not only to the yields of the program, but also the costs that the program has or will infer on her. First is, of course, that she has to pay interest on the student loan, so 8%. So this means the program will not cost 20,000, but will actually cost her 21,600. So 8% of 20,000 is 1,600, plus 20,000 is 21,600. But second, and more importantly, by sacrificing a year, she technically also loses 30,000 euros that she could have made by skipping the program and going to work. So this is the opportunity cost, and this is nicely explained in the figure that's also on the slide. So without the program, her income would be a steady line of 30,000 euros a year. Yeah, it's displayed here. With the program, she will be at 0 of a year, and then she will jump to 35,000 euros a year until she is 35 years old. So in fact, the real cost of the program is 51,600. So 31,000 foregone income plus the 21,600 for the tuition fee with interest. So this implies if she wants to have a return on investment, she might need to work more than 10 years. So in fact, specifically 11 years. So based on these parameters, she might decide maybe it's not worth the effort to invest in the welders program. Sam's course is of course an example, and an answer that we came up with was simply a reflection of the parameters that were involved there. But why this example is because it introduces some of the factors that affect the return of investment of education for employees. First is the training effectiveness. So how much added value does the training offer? The higher the added value of training, say if Sam would earn 10,000 a year more instead of 5,000 a year more, then the quicker the return on investment, of course. Second is the length of the training. That is, the longer that Sam would be in the welding program, or alternatively, the longer you do as a student over your study progress, the longer it takes before money can be made and returns can be realized. So the longer you also have foregone income. Third are the direct and indirect costs or opportunity costs. So training typically infers some costs. For example, the tuition fee. This can also, of course, be course material. This can be transport costs. These are direct costs because you pay for them directly. But important, training also infers indirect costs. So unless employees are, of course, in a paid internship or they learn on the job, training often implies that employees forego income or that they miss out on other opportunities to make money, hence opportunity cost. Of course, makes sense, the lower the direct and indirect or opportunity costs, the faster the return on investments. Fourth is the time horizon, also speaks a bit for itself. So the longer the time you can enjoy the benefits, the longer as an employee you stay in the labor market and robots stay away from your job, the faster the return on investment. Then 5, of course, a useful skill. So the use of learned skill, a useful skill is more likely to pay off than a non-useful skill. If Sam would invest 20,000 euros in tap dance classes, well, she could put it on her resume, technically, but it's less likely to pay off financially in the near future. Why this example tap dance classes, well, it brings me to another point. That is, in personal economics, employees and organizations, they are, remember from the first class, they are rational actors, so they are mostly concerned with the financial utility of their decisions, so here of their training decisions. But in reality, of course, training is always an investment in oneself. It's likely to pay off or to be worthwhile from other points of view. People usually don't go into training purely for the financial reason alone. So if you want to do the tap dance classes, so please don't hesitate. Do it if you must and put it on your resume if you like. Okay, before we move on, some students, well, they might think that the example of 20,000 euros for a welding program is a bit of an exaggerated example. While the book is American, of course, yeah, people pay more for their education there. Also, yeah, most people, they don't really go into full personal economics mode when they make a training decision. But I think maybe a better illustration in this sense is that of an MBA. So an MBA is an advanced business qualification that is offered by some business schools. And I think who knows, some of you might even end up in an MBA, since you're all a bunch of very ambitious international HR people. Now, MBAs, they are really the ticket to C-level functions. They're often also very good for expanding your professional network. However, MBAs, they are typically very labor-intensive, and yeah, they tend to come with a kind of price tag. To illustrate a latter point, consider the example of Nijenrode. So Nijenrode, if you don't know it, it's an elite business school in the Netherlands. It's in Breukelen, close to Utrecht. And a 1-year full-time in this program costs about 42,000 euros. Now, might seem a lot, but this is the usual price for an MBA. So we're talking about a real investment there. And in fact, there's actually much more expensive MBAs than that. Fortunately, of course, employees do not always bear the full financial burden of their training. Now, as we saw in statistics I showed earlier, so I think it was about 70% of professional training that is paid for by the organizations themselves. But it does not mean that organizations simply pay for all professional training. This example is illustrated in the example of Sarah. So Sarah here is an employee at Rabobank. Let's say she works in Breda, close by. So Rabobank is considering of sending Sarah, one of their financial potentials, top potentials. They're going to send her on an undefined training. Now, as long as nothing changes, Sarah will produce Qn. So remember, so the green line, remember Q stands for production. So we're talking about yields for the organization now, so not yields for the employee. So without training, Sarah will produce the base level Qn or Q normal. But of course, Rabobank expects that the training will, of course, pay off. So after the training, Sarah will be more productive and she will produce Qt. It's almost QD, but Qt, so for training. However, sending Sarah off for training also, of course, means that they're going to miss her for a period. So during the training period, she will produce nothing, and that's for a certain amount of time, so for T asterisk, the undefined length of training. So this is basically a time that Sarah will produce nothing, but of course that they will still pay her. So this is foregone productivity from the side of the organization. Okay, so what you have probably noticed in this example is that the criteria for a training decision are basically the same for employees as they are for organizations. There's first the effectiveness of the training. So what is the difference between what she produces after the training and what she produces before the training? So the difference between Q training and Q normal. Also the length of the training, so T asterisk, so the time they are going to have to miss her. Also depends on the direct and opportunity costs, so the cost of the training, this is unspecified here, as well as the foregone production, of course. Time horizon also matters. There were no limits set to the time horizon in this example, but of course, the longer the organization can enjoy the benefits of training in the form of better production, the more beneficial for the organization. But there is one crucial difference between an optimal training decision for an organization compared to that of an employee, and that is the type of training that is involved. Now, on the one hand, training can serve general skills. So in general skills, think about language courses, IT courses like Microsoft Office, courses on conflict management. Now, these general skills, we also call them transferable skills because their use can be transferred from one setting to another. That is, they are useful to both current employer and potential future employers. So general skills is more valuable to organizations than, of course, so it's valuable to your current employer or to your current organizations to the extent that you also stay within the organization, to the extent you're also attached to the organization. On the other hand, training can also serve firm-specific skills, for example, learning to work with company software, procedures, or even having to obtain some kind of internal certificates that are not recognized outside of the organization, but nevertheless mandatory within the organization. Now, these kind of trainings, they are only valuable to the current employer. They're not transferable, so they basically lose their value when you as an employee leave the firm. Now, knowing and assuming that all four previous criteria are met, Rabobank is probably less likely to send Sarah for general skills training, unless, of course, they are fully sure that Sarah is loyal to the organization. They will, however, be more inclined to send her on firm-specific training. So organizations' optimal training decision for employees also strongly depends on the type of training. But of course, who pays? Who gets the bill? And there are three logical options that we come up with. Of course, it could be the organization, it could be Rabobank, it could be Sarah herself, so the employee self, or they can just split the costs together. As we will see, what is the ideal decision and when, it also depends on the type of training involved. Okay, well, let's first consider the three scenarios for general training. So training that also has value with other organizations. Now, remember here, it's summarized in the table, the direct costs, they refer to the costs of the training that are directly paid for. Indirect costs, they are missed opportunities like foregone productivity, while gains and results, they refer to to increase productivity, of course, after the training. Now, in the first scenario, the organization pays all, so they pay for the training, but they also absorb the productivity loss. They keep paying while Sarah is in the training period, although she produces almost nothing. And the cost of training, the indirect costs, and both the direct costs, they are both borne by the organization, while in the end, actually, it's Sarah who comes out as more beneficial. She is more productive for the organization, but she also has more leverage. She can ask firms for a higher wage. And if she gets a better offer from an organization, she can be poached away. So, poaching offer, because now she's more valuable, she's more trained. So by paying everything for general training, an organization makes an investment, but has no guarantee that this investment will also pay off. Now, the organization could also decide, okay, let's split the cost together. That way the risks are partly absorbed, but in the end, the employee can still ask for a higher wage or get still poached away. So even though the costs might be reduced, it's still not a sustainable solution because the organization can still use investments and there's still the poaching problem. So to an external organization that's still the same, is still a more valuable employee. What's better then actually is to let the employee pay for general training. Now, in this scenario, the employee fully bears the costs, but also fully enjoys the benefits. The organization can pay her a higher wage without they have to worry about loss of previous investment. And when the organization leaves the organization, well, there are no losses either. So from an economic standpoint, it's better that employees pay for general training. And if you think a bit about it, it also makes sense. Your employer should not pay for your typing lessons, should not pay for your English classes. It's better that they spend their training budget in other ways. Okay, let's consider the other scenario, so that one of firm-specific training. Now here we find that in case one, the organization is again vulnerable. So the organization absorbs all of the costs while they are not sure this will pay off. Think about it, firm-specific training is mostly in most organizations also internally developed. So they set up an own training program that also costs time and money that's indirectly not in this calculation. In the end, of course, the employee has enjoyed firm-specific training, but it does not tie this employee necessary to the organization. Here, even though the new talents are not necessarily valuable outside of the organization, he or she might still leave, might still receive a better offer from another organization, leading the organization, of course, to suffer a loss of investment. However, if you say, okay, so not the organization, let's not make the organization vulnerable. If you let the employee pay for everything, then the employee finds itself in a very vulnerable position. So when employees are actually asked here to make a very specific investment without value outside of the organization. So when they are fired, employees risk completely losing their investment. So the fact that an employee makes a specific investment in firm-specific training does not protect his employee against getting fired. So the result is that it's better when firm-specific training is concerned that organizations and employees share the costs. So to avoid that one party pays all and gets all the costs and all the risks at the same time. So in sum, it's better that employees pay for general training and that they split the costs with organizations when firm-specific training is concerned. We call this Becker's model of training. It's named after Gary Becker. So Gary Becker is a Nobel Prize-winning family economist. He's from the University of Chicago. He also wrote some important works on human capital. Now, Becker's model, of course, it's a theory, but there's also the real world out there. Now, the real world out there poses some limits to Becker's model. First, as you might have already guessed or felt a little bit, the difference between general skills and specific skills is not always so clear-cut as theory seems to suggest. For example, if you have to learn to work with some very company-specific administration software, might also increase your general proficiency in dealing with similar software packages. So in reality, general skills, firm-specific skills, is not black and white. It's more of a gray area. Second is that human capital is more complex. So in addition to general and firm-specific skills, employees also possess alternative skills. So these are skills that are not used in the current job, but are nevertheless important. Think about, for example, knowledge of statistical analysis. Think about language skills. So while these are the type of skills that quickly erode over time, both employees and organizations, they typically have little incentives to invest in these alternative skills. So that's also why you should be very aware of narrow-skilled jobs, because they limit the amount of human capital that you use in your current job, that you develop, but also the type of capital that organizations will invest in, or you feel urged to invest in yourself. In addition, of course, skills can be specific to specific occupations, industries, and location. So it's not only firm specificity, can also be specific for a certain sector, country, or another context. So be valuable, less valuable than general skills, but more valuable than firm-specific skills. Third is training contracts. So if we go back to what we saw before, so we saw about 70% of professional training in the Netherlands is paid for by organizations. It's very unlikely that this is all firm-specific. So in reality, organizations are much likely to pay for the training themselves than the theory leads us to believe. However, what they will do is often they will put a clause in employees' contracts. For example, they will state that after the training period, the employee will have to stay with the organization for some time, or that they can't work for competitors after they have enjoyed the training. And finally is the existence of certain laws and policies. Typically, these laws and policies, they shift the balance more in favor of the employees. For example, if I looked it up, countries like Belgium, Germany, Canada, Sweden, they have educational leave schemes. Like, for example, in Germany, the Bildungsurlaub. These are schemes that stimulate employees to engage in training, so they get additional leave from work to engage in training. What is the gain for the organization? Well, the government partly covers the indirect costs of their absence. So the employee can enjoy training, but there is no foregone income because the government partly absorbs this cost. Sometimes professional training is also partly tax deductible, so also the direct cost is sometimes partly absorbed by the government. So through the existence of certain laws and policies, governments sometimes absorb part of the direct and indirect costs, shifting the balance more in favor of the employee. So in other words, Becker's training model might seem a bit pessimistic for employees, or that was at least my first general impression when I first heard about it. Luckily, reality shifts the balance more in favor of employees compared to organizations. Another thing that often happens in reality is that after training has occurred, employees and organizations, they engage in bargaining. Now, sometimes bargaining can lead to more efficient training decisions. Right? For example, that after an employee has paid the full costs, that the firm agrees to pay a part, for example, so leading to more efficiency or more equality. However, that specific bargaining, or just the prospect of that bargaining, it can create some disincentives to invest in training in the first place, and this for both sides. First, let us consider the example of the employee, so Sarah. Sarah has invested in training, and in return she is promised a higher wage by Rabobank. Now, when Sarah does not put this on paper, and Rabobank does not honor its promise, she ends up having invested in training for nothing. So in economics, we call this investment a sunk cost, a cost that cannot be recuperated. So anticipating that Rabobank might not honor its promise, Sarah might want to avoid investing in training in the first place. The same thing can happen to Rabobank as an organization. They might send Sarah on training, they might also pay the full bill, but then Sarah comes back and she demands a higher wage because, of course, she anticipates that she is more productive to the organization, that she is more valuable to the organization. So anticipating that the training might give Sarah more bargaining power, more leverage because she's more productive and valuable to them, the organization might refrain from sending her on training because they don't want to give her IDs. Now, both of these examples I've just given, they are illustrations of the hold-up problem. So this problem states that when relation-specific investments are made, they could lead. So problem is that when relation-specific investments are made, that leads to bargaining. After these investments are made, the sheer anticipation of this bargaining can lead parties to avoid making these investments in the first place. So it means here that firm-specific training investments that cannot be recuperated later, so being sunk costs, they can result in that these investments are not made in the first place, creating a hold-up problem. We also find some examples of this hold-up problem in today's economy. For example, printers, they're generally ridiculously cheap these days. But on the other hand, the cartridges, they cost a fortune. Now, by buying a printer, you make a relation-specific investment. And your costs are also sunk because after you buy them, you can't return the printer because the cartridges are expensive. So basically, by selling you a printer, the organization has created a relation of economic dependency with you. You become reliant on the cartridges and you cannot ask your money back. Now, if you are smart and you anticipate that, you decide not to invest in this printer, creating a hold-up problem for the organization. Another example is Apple. Apple, part of their business model is they create a problem and they sell you the solution, urging you to make relation-specific investments. For example, like they did to me, they sell you an iPhone 7, and now you come home and you realize it has no jack for your earphones, so you have to buy their Bluetooth earpods. Now, knowing that, you might want to invest in a Samsung Galaxy instead and be more smart. So indeed, these are the hold-up problems. Now, what can employees do about hold-up problems? Well, the existence of a hold-up problem is actually a lesson for employees to refrain from making firm-specific investments in training, especially if there are some reasons to believe that the organization will act opportunistic. For example, when the organization finds itself in a transition, in a merger, in a takeover, or finds itself in a crisis situation, financially unstable waters. These are all factors that might impact employees' resources and decision-making so that they might induce the organization not to honor its promise in the first place. What's better? Well, better is to think ahead, anticipate future bargaining power. Well, this is, of course, easier said than done. What's better? Well, better is to secure agreements, put it on paper. But thirdly, luckily in Europe, there are also certain laws. There's unions, there's collective bargaining agreements, and they typically also protect employees against hold-up problems from occurring. Okay, small recap. So far we have considered the importance of investing in training and when investment in training makes sense from an economic point of view, that is, both from the side of the employee, both of the side of the organization as well. We also saw that the type of training was a key element in unraveling the economic world of a training. However, an important question is, okay, when do I stop training employees? To what extent should employees be trained? Having better trained employees is always better because it develops their human capital, might increase organizational performance as well, but resources are scarce, so where should we direct our training resources? At first sight, the decision of to what extent to develop employees is closely related to the type of jobs they are in. Now, employees in lower skilled jobs or that do more routine work, for example, assembly workers, call center workers, they are often given no more than a basic training, just to get them going, just to do their task. On the other hand, employees in more high-skilled jobs and employees in typically like entry positions, they enjoy a much broader training base, especially trainings because like that's the goal of their position, to learn. But there are also organizations that ensure that all of their employees are more broadly skilled, regardless of function. While this seems expensive, there are also some indications that it might pay off. So multi-skilling employees, it's associated with a couple of advantages. One of them being increased process innovation. This was demonstrated in a famous study by Carmichael and McLeod in '93. Now, what these researchers did is they did a study of different HR practices in Japanese firm. Now, what's a bit of background is in the 80s and 90s, there was this huge interest from the general public, from managers, from management researchers in Japan. Now, why was this the case? It was at that time, Japanese firms like Toyota, Mitsubishi, Yamaha, but also Nintendo for the soft gamers among us, they were really booming at that time. So all firms, they actually wanted to copy the Japanese model. This is also something we see still today, for example, in terms like lean, terms like Kanban. They're typically management strategies that were inspired by the Japanese way of working. Now, what characterized Japanese HRM at that time? Well, first, Japanese HR was very engaged with multi-skilling of all the employees. How did they do that? Well, frequently they adopted job rotation. So all employees or different employees would be familiar with the different tasks and different positions in the organization, so by regularly switching jobs. And in a sense, this also gave relatively job security because the employees could do several tasks within the organization. But also, especially at that time, 80s, so before 80s, before 90s, and in the Japanese context, people, they work for the organization for life. So there was no real risk for the organizations of poaching problems, and if they made investments in training, they were more likely to pay off. And finally, there was also a big respect for seniority, so for older and more experienced workers. Now, what did the researchers find out? They found out that these practices, and especially the practice of multi-skilling, was very important for continuous process innovation. Now, well, you can compare it a bit to lean. So what is continuous process innovation? It refers to changes in productivity that are basically obtained by shifting resources in the firm around. So the firm is not investing in additional resources, it's not saving on existing resources, it's more shifting things around. Often this results gradual and is the result of employee actions or suggestions. Now, if we would translate this more to HR terms, we could speak of some kind of organizational citizenship behavior occurring or innovative work behavior. So, or maybe even voice. So employees doing small suggestions at improvement, gradually also benefiting organizational performance. Now, the reason multi-skilling worked so well in the Japanese firms was because in the normal sense, a narrow-skilled worker also might have innovative ideas, maybe plenty, but might be reluctant in telling those ideas. Because making a suggestion, their own work or their own position might be compromised in doing so. This is less of a problem for multi-skilled workers, because even if they completely eliminate their job, in the most extreme case, of course, the fact that they did job rotation, they could easily take up another job. So this ensured that they were more likely to report their innovative ideas to improve processes at work. What's more, many Japanese companies, they even further incentivized giving these ideas by offering paid overtime to employees for consulting with one another over process improvements. And as a result of being able to stay longer in the firms and being incentivized for their innovative ideas, employees were also more likely to embrace new technologies or invest in firm-specific skills, so we're also more open to things coming from the organization. So in other words, multi-skilling through job rotation as a key aspect of Japanese HR practices was very effective at stimulating the job performance of Japanese organizations. Why? Because it created job security, it induced continuous process improvements, and employees were more open to training and new things. Maybe final note of criticism we can give here is if we think back to class 3, so the class on monetary and non-monetary incentives. There we saw that incentivizing employees for IDs through paid overtime, well, it could maybe also have crowded out intrinsic motivation. So from a really personnel economics point of view, we could maybe even say that better results could have obtained without this extra compensation. Okay, so what have we learned today? We have learned today that economic benefits, that they are reduced if the direct and opportunity costs are higher, if the training is longer, so that the employee organization not only has to pay more directly, but also that they forego more on income or productivity. The economic benefits of training increase when the returns can be leaped, of course, over a longer time, so that the employee can remain in the labor market longer time, that the skill does not become obsolete, and that he or she can also stay within the organization. We also saw that according to Becker's model, employees should pay for general training, so training that has value for different organizations, or training that has only value for the current organization. Employees and organizations should split the costs. Training can also create holder problems, so if we give either employees or organizations more leverage in bargaining, the pure anticipation of bargaining by the other party might refrain from these investments being made in the first place. Subsequently, we saw that multi-skilling can have advantages, even though while expensive. So multi-skilling, it can increase the value of an employee to the organization. It can give an employee also more job security at the same time, and also more confidence, of course, to come up with ideas for improvement or to invest in training. But maybe as a final conclusion of today is the fact that training and hiring, that they are closely related to each other. Now, in earlier classes, we saw that pay, motivation, hiring, that they are or can be sides of the same coin. If you think back about the Lazare study, so changing the compensation schedule changed the type of employees that the organization attracted. Now, the same applies to training and hiring. Why is that? It's because the human capital of an employee is also directly linked to the decision whether or not to invest in the employee and or keep him or her within the organization. Training also relates to a kind of make or buy decision. So should we invest in attracting a high talent employee, or should we make, between brackets, a highly talented employee themselves? So training indeed and hiring, they are closely related decisions. Now, on that bombshell, of course, it's all for today. I hope to see you next week. Then will be a bit of a longer session, and I will talk about competition within firms.